Hi there, welcome. My name's Juniper Muller. I'm the president of the Melbourne Bisexual Network, here to talk once again on Bent TV, all about things Bi Plus. And I'm so excited here today to be joined by Duc.
Thanks, Juniper. Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I am one of the coordinators of Bi Community Perth, and I've known Juniper for over a year now, mostly online, but I'm sure we will meet one day. I work for an Aboriginal community controlled organisation, and I also do my own research on the side. So, currently finishing a long overdue book, academic book.
I'm excited to read it when it comes out. I mean, if you think it would be interesting.
Yeah, if you're familiar with the Song of Songs, which is an erotic book in the Bible, then go for it. Yeah, there are quite a few queers that I talk about, but yeah, it's just going to be a range of authors and artists.
I'm not familiar, but I'm like super willing to dive into it. It sounds interesting.
Yeah,
And I
well, the
think
Song of
like
Songs is read at weddings quite a bit. At Harry and Megan's wedding, it was read, but there are certain parts that are much more erotic in metaphor than others, so I recommend those as well.
I think it's actually so fascinating and interesting to look at the what was the erotic through history and through sort of like different kinds of literature and things. Because of course, like bisexuality isn't new, but maybe the word or like the framing as a defined identity or existence is r- relatively new, right? Um, and so reading older texts and sort of like reading in with a lens of modern sexuality, I think is curious or trying to like make sense of it.
The terms for sexuality have only been in existence for just over 100 years, I guess, especially with the onset of sexology. But people have been bisexual in behaviour for centuries, even if they might not have defined themselves as such or society defined them as such. But I guess it's behaviour that is of much more interest when it comes to calling someone, say, a sodomite or whatever. And I was thinking about how even sexuality is not even that important in film in terms of like how does this person identify, because we don't actually care because we're mostly interested in the act that they engage in, and
Mm.
that act could be a threesome with a man or a woman or a trans person, and it's and in some ways that goes back to pre-sexology where action is much more important than how you identify.
And those different actions being more or less taboo or illegal or sinful. How are they read by society and how are they important? Different to like attraction, like we talk about bisexuality now as sexual attraction to more than one gender, um, which like regardless of behavior, like someone can be bisexual and have never had
Mm.
sex with anyone, just as we talk about people, maybe being like straight or heterosexual even if they're a quote unquote virgin, which is a certainly quite a shift in thinking about film, or TV or whatever it might be. That some of the interest from the viewer's perspective is who's having sex with whom, and how do you represent bisexuality within that? Well, maybe that looks like a threesome with multiple genders involved, or more than three. Maybe it looks like the same person having sex, with like a series of people of different genders across time. But I'm also curious about desire or attraction and maybe how we
Mm.
represent that, or like ongoing relationship.
Yeah, I mean, how do you represent bisexuality if someone isn't having sex, I guess? In film at least, or in narrative it might be easier, or poetry, people talk about desires even if they're not necessarily acting them. I don't know about you, but growing up, a lot of the films and books that I read were about queer desire, longing that may or may not be
Yeah.
consummated. And that seemed like the quintessential queer experience that hopefully isn't so prevalent now, but it possibly is, especially for people of my generation growing up in the 80s and 90s, where we often didn't even have that much representation. So we had to read between the lines or, look for subtext. And if there was something, it was just like, let's get this, even though it wasn't not necessarily the best film of the year, or or what we might call great representation. But yeah, I guess I grew up reading lots of poems and books as well, and queer desire is often better articulated or much more easily understood when you read about it. Because in film, you need to represent it usually, unless you have the narrator saying something or just the camera showing looks of longing if that person wasn't having sex at that moment. And so I think there are different ways that we can represent it, and quite often it is through looks or through thoughts and or people's understanding of a character before the character even understands themselves. I think there are many interesting representations now. Sometimes people just talk about it, and that's what I really like. So with Booksmart, the narrative isn't necessarily the coming out, I'm feeling so tortured that I'm queer. It's just I I just am, and it's kind of I'm peace with that. But so they moved beyond that kind of tortured coming out narrative to just I'm queer and I'm interested in this person, and I'll have sex for the first time with them, and it's very awkward and funny, but and that I think that awkwardness actually decreases the audience's own expectations, but also it makes us remember maybe our first experience as well, or our own fears before we have sex of what it would be like. And I think that kind of resonance is really important with, I guess, even when you're growing up as a young person. I read books that I can, kind of see myself in, reflected through the characters, and I think that's what we resonate with. Like, does this character's experience kind of resemble mine? And I think even if it's not going to win literary awards, that kind of reflection is what we are hoping for when we read a text or when we watch a film.
And I think that kind of awkwardness gives room for imperfection, that gives dimension to a character, so that they're not just a walking archetype of the sexually intimidating villain, or this kind of one-dimensional character, or that kind. That awkwardness, in Booksmart is, yeah, fantastic and funny and sort of like awful, and great all at once. And
Yeah.
that idea of complicated, unfulfilled queer desire of the love that dare not speak its name, like this taboo kind of thing, is also, to a degree, it's nice to be able to see it just like awkward teenage crushes and um agonizing over how to ask that person out on a date, but it happens to be, yeah, like someone of the same sex, um, and
Yeah.
those questions of what does it mean that I'm attracted to this person, and what does it
Mm.
mean to have a crush on this person.
I've been reading quite a lot of YA recently in the last couple of years to kind of unwind, but I'm actually enjoying reading them because I think there's things that I could have read when I was a teenager growing up, but I didn't find that, and now it's much more readily available, I think, and less taboo, but also very well written. And I appreciate the kind of literary quality, but also how entertaining it is and how much it reflects my own experiences growing up, and even now, I suppose. I still go through awkward phases. You don't grow out of that unless yes, you're a villain in a movie like Sharon Stone. I mean, can you imagine having sex with Sharon Stone and then just being super awkward like in Booksmart? It's just not going to happen. In Basic Instinct, everyone is perfect, has perfect sex. It's just, that is very intimidating.
Earlier on, yeah, we were talking about this idea of like what does queer, what does bi, or what does pansexual look like on screen, and maybe it looks like particular acts or particular, like kisses or sex, whatever it might be. But there is also the idea of queer coding, and that characters will be like coded as straight or as gay or as lesbian. You see a woman, a female character enters into the story with like a buzz cut and like one pierced ear and like a flannel shirt, like maybe riding a motorbike, or with the carabiner on her belt, and like that's lesbian coding, and there's some familiarity with that and some sort of assumptions that go along with that, positive and negative. What is bi plus coding? Well, we actually don't
Yeah.
particularly have it, um,
No.
and and I think that's due to a bunch of different things. It's partially due to bi people like blending in either into straight culture and like straight relationships, or into gay culture and like queer relationships and queer culture, and to do the mix of both, or to find its own unique sort of identity or difference, it's kind of tricky.
In a binaristic world, we're coded as either straight or gay, depending on the length of our hair, our fashion, who we're with, so a range of things. So I do like it when things are complicated. Say, I know Chasing Amy has been controversial in some ways, but I do like that she looks a particular way and it's not necessarily coded as straight or gay. And then she identifies as gay at the start, and then she falls in love with Holden. And I have to say that scene in the rain is so romantic. I really like it, and I did see it more than the movie, but yes, that scene more than once. Um, but what she looks like doesn't change after that, from what I remember. It's not. Whereas I guess for some queers, as they move into a more comfortable place with their sexuality, they kind of change their looks, or experiment with their looks, and then might cut their hair short or might look a particular way. Whereas I do like it when people don't necessarily identify in terms of their looks, that they don't code it. Whereas yeah, sometimes we do need that coding. However, what does it look like to be a bi, as you said? Short hair for a woman, or someone who's read as a woman. We're a pretty diverse bunch, and it's very hard to just code us by our looks on screen.
There are pros and cons to that. It's something that means that people will almost never assume that someone is bisexual, unless they're wearing like I'm wearing like bi flag like earrings at the moment, or if someone's wearing a flag. Other than that, you'll almost never be assumed to be bisexual, which means that in order to like flag it, or code it or express it, there's got to be some explicitness to it, which I
Yeah,
think a lot of people are reluctant to do and tend much more towards, I don't use a label, or using like one of those murky fuzzy labels like queer. Maybe privately identify as bisexual. Like if you had to really pin me down, I might put bisexual or pansexual. But maybe most of their friends or family or community wouldn't know. And they're actually kind of happy enough letting people assume what they want to assume.
or switching between codes, like code switching between different communities. With your family, you come across in one way; with your friends, another. At work, depending on who you're out to. This is something that I've been thinking about quite a bit in terms of bisexual representation, or who you see as being bi, and it is often white people, I have to admit, especially in Australia and in the anglophone speaking world. And so quite often people of color often missed as bi or queer even. So often, because I have long hair and I don't really dress in a particular way, I've got pretty eclectic style. People won't automatically assume that I'm queer or bi until I open my mouth or something. And so even when I was teaching, my students wouldn't necessarily pick up on things unless they Googled my profile or something and see that I've published on quite a few queer things.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
it's so funny that one of my former students said that she and a friend of hers picked up that I was one of them after I after I, just said something quite casual, but it was, what was it? I can't remember exactly, but I just said something, and it was about some obscure sexual act or something that, not just men, but women as well. And then they picked up on that, along with maybe a few other things over the course of the weeks that we'd been in class. So they picked up on these things, and sometimes I put them out there, even if I didn't it didn't come out outright as bisexual. And in teaching in situations like teaching, it's not necessarily appropriate or
Mm,
important to come out.
yeah.
But yes, I do make a point of being an ally. So that's part. The ally network is something we have at our university, and at most universities in Australia, we have them now. So I would come out as an ally, just so that students would know that it's a safe space, and that once or twice in a classroom, I have come out as bi. So you have to determine what the right situation would be, and go from there.
That visibility can sometimes be about safety and like navigating safety or appropriateness. Yeah, like with your job and things. Can also, like on the dating scene, can be about trying to attract the kinds of people who you want to attract. I guess this idea of the choice to be read as different things. And,
Mm.
depending on who you are and what you look like, that might be more or less of a choice. In the kind of realm of like gender and trans and gender diverse folks, we sometimes talk about being visibly trans and having sort of like mixed features such that people might be more likely to guess your gendered history or guess that you're of trans experience, and that can come with some really significant dangers. On the other hand, like going stealth or passing and having people assume that you're cisgender comes with some other stuff too. I was thinking just the other day about my non-binary identity and sort of the crossover of issues between non-binary gender and non-binary sexuality. What is the usefulness of an identity that crosses categories or takes yourself out of the categories altogether? And I think sometimes that's the challenge that bisexuality lays down, is to say this idea that there are two boxes, straight or gay, is rubbish. Um, I'm not only in one, I'm not only in the other, and it's sort of odd to say that I'm in both categories,
Mm.
or in between, or yeah, or like just a phase of like going from one to a.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, language is pretty complex. It's necessary, but also it's fraught. It changes over time, and different people interpret words differently. Even people would say a criticism I've heard of the term non-binary is that it relies on the binary to define itself, which goes against what its purpose is. So I think for people to use the term non-binary, for some people, it's absolutely the word that they would want. For others, it's a starting point to consider their identity, and then they go beyond that because over time it might be seen as being limiting, that it's boxes. And some people would say that's the same with the term bisexual or bi plus even. Um,
Right.
that's why they might prefer the term queer, or it's just in the end it's like no label. I think it depends on the individual, where they are at, where they are, and where they feel they might be going. I don't know, but it can change for individuals over time as well, and other people might take on extra identities. So you'll have people who identify as bisexual, and then after that they might add pansexual as a label, so they're not mutually exclusive. So it's postmodern. We can add on different labels according to the situation or how we feel, or we could
Yeah.
decide we're beyond labels. I think that's one of the great things about being bi plus. It's a little bit grey. Sometimes it can make us anxious, but it can be also a place of freedom, depending on how you feel and how much freedom you feel that using terms, but also not necessarily exclusively, or using them as a starting point can be. So you might feel that the term lesbian or straight is very narrow and it's kind of limiting, and then it limits who your attractions are directed to and what your actions are like. But if for a lot of bi people, it's not limiting. It's like it I can be attracted to whomever I want and have sex with whom I want, as long as it's consensual, obviously. Hopefully
Yeah.
pleasurable.
Hopefully pleasurable for all involved. Yeah.
Oh yes, I quite like the book Pleasure Activism, and
Yeah.
I feel I'd rather be celibate than have really bad sex. Have to admit, it's like I'd rather read a good book with a happy ending or something. Then, go through the motions of like beautifying myself, having bad sex, and then having to have an STI test afterwards. It's just like a lot of work for something that wasn't really worth it in the end. It's just one of those things you consider. Lots of things give me pleasure. And I think as you get older, you kind of realize this, that there are many tactile pleasures available that aren't necessarily genital focused. And this is something I actually learned from just reading a bit more about asexuality. It's not necessarily about the genitals, it's about just many different ways of being
Yeah.
attracted to things or just feeling pleasure. And I think also, if you do read the book Pleasure Activism, it's quite illuminating because pleasure is found in many different places. And if I'm correct, it is influenced by Audre Lorde's essay on the uses of the erotic, and then how she talks about how she can find pleasure in so many different things, in poetry, in just moving along the body of her lover, and not necessarily just in the act of sex. It's just it's actually very there's
I think
freedom
that
to that.
that sense of like pleasure as a source of strength or power or energy, but also I really loved what you were saying earlier on about bi plus being sometimes a space of anxiety, of uncertainty, but also one of such freedom, like a dropping of rule sets, and a dropping of those harsh borders of the boxes that sometimes cut bits of us off, or tell us that a certain thought or feeling or touch was wrong. Whereas if we tune in more deeply into our nuanced sense of desire, and can embrace that desire, embrace those different sorts of pleasures, it can open up such a world for us.
Oh, for sure. I mean, some of the most erotic poetry I've ever read was written by celibate saints and mystics. It's just so intense and beautiful. Sure, they had rules that circumscribed their lives, but within those rules, they found such freedom in expression and in experience that it's just really quite. I've actually learned a lot from reading about the saints and reading their work. And I study it and I've written about it and how it has influenced, especially Catholic converts in the 19th century. So I do seem to write
Mm.
quite a bit about queer Catholic converts who become celibate. It's very niche, but their work is so often influenced by medieval or Renaissance or post-Renaissance saints, and how they are influenced by the Song of Songs, hence coming back to that. And it's such an important book to quiz because it is canonical, but precariously so, because for over the centuries its place in the Bible has been debated. So why is this book, which does not mention God and is very sensuous, why is this in the Bible? And of course, there are people who have argued that, oh, it's in there because it's about the metaphorical relationship between the church the people or the individual and God. And so that's one way of reading it, but there are other ways of reading it, and queers have just um, held on to that as something that is in a way socially acceptable, but also quite open in how it can be interpreted, and it is about desire and love, and how love is strong as death, and how these things can be so powerful in our lives. So it's a really fascinating book, and I recommend it. I can recommend it. It's not very long, and there are some very unusual metaphors, because for us, we're not growing up in a pastoral setting thousands of years ago. So comparing the lover's body to, a flock of sheep might seem a bit unusual, but these were things that were precious and dear. So why not compare your lover's teeth to a flock of sheep, because
Yeah.
they were worth something. And they give life.
We might kind of look at wrapping up there for today, Duke, but it's been such a pleasure seeing you, having a big old chat about everything today. I've got some reading to do, yeah, and I really absolutely encourage our our audience to dive into some of it, because they're not the typical things that necessarily, especially young queer people go to for queer texts at the moment. But yeah, thank you so much again.
Well, thanks for having me. As I said, it's been a pleasure, and I look forward to coming on again at some point in the near future.
Bye for now. And we'll look forward to seeing you again next time. Thanks so much, Bent TV, for having us.